Action, we now come to the statement where I call the Business Secretary on industrial action.
Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I'd like to make a statement on industrial action and minimum service levels. Nurses, paramedics, transport workers are called key workers for a reason. They truly are the lifeblood of the country. Every person sitting in this chamber is grateful for the work and the job that they do, and we agree, and I know everyone will agree with me, that we cannot do without them. So the government will always defend their ability to withdraw their labour. But we also recognise the pressures faced by both those working in the public sector, and yesterday I invited union leaders in for talks across government, and I'm pleased to say we've seen some progress. We want to resolve disputes where possible while delivering what is fair and reasonable to the taxpayer as well, and at the moment all households are struggling with the repercussions of high inflation caused by COVID and Putin's barbaric invasion of Ukraine, and this government absolutely focused on tackling that. So granting inflation-busting pay deals which step outside of the independent pay review settlement process is not the sensible way to proceed, and it won't provide a fair outcome. What we continue to consult on instead is to find meaningful ways forward for the unions to work with employers to improve the process and discuss the evidence which we have now submitted. In the meantime, the government also has a duty to protect the public's access to essential public services. Because whilst we absolutely believe in the right to strike, we're duty-bound to protect the lives and the livelihoods of the British people. The British people need to know that when they have a heart attack, a stroke or a serious injury, that an ambulance will turn up, and that if they need hospital care, they have access to it. And that's because they need to know that not only are those services available, but they're able to get trains and buses, particularly for those who are most likely to be the least well off in society. So I'd like to thank the Royal College of Nurses, who during the last strike worked with health officials at a national level to ensure safe levels of cover were in place when they took industrial action. They kept services like emergencies and acute care running. They may have disagreed, but they showed that they could do their protest in a reasonable and mature way whilst withdrawing their labour. As ever, they put the public first. We need all our public services to do the same. A lack of timely cooperation from the ambulance unions meant employers could not reach agreement nationally for minimum safety levels during recent strikes, and health officials were left guessing at the likely minimum coverage, making contingency planning almost impossible and putting everyone's constituents' lives at risk. The ambulance strike plan for tomorrow still do not have minimum safety levels in place. And this will result in patchy emergency care for the British people, and this cannot continue. It's for moments like this that we're introducing legislation, focusing on blue light emergency services and delivering on our manifesto commitment to secure minimum service on the railways as well. So I'm introducing a bill that will give government the power to ensure that vital public services will have to maintain a basic function by delivering minimum safety levels, ensuring that lives and livelihoods are not lost. Mr. Speaker, we're looking at 6 key areas, each of them critical for keeping the British people safe and society functioning. These are health, education, fire, rescue, transport, border security and nuclear decommissioning. We do not want to use this legislation, but we must ensure the safety of the British public. During the passage of the bill, we intend to consult on what an adequate level of coverage looks like in fire, ambulance and in rail services. For the other sectors covered in the bill, we hope to reach minimum service agreements that mean that we don't have to use that power in the bill, and they will be able to come to that position just as the nurses have done in the recent strikes. Mr. Speaker, this is a common sense approach, and we're not the first to follow it. The legislation will bring us in line with modern European countries like France and Spain and Italy and Germany, each of whom already have these types of rules in place. Even the guardians of workers' rights around the world, the International Labour Organization, to whom the TUC themselves subscribe, say that minimum service levels are a proportionate way of balancing the right to strike with the need to protect the wider public. Because the first job of any government is to keep the public safe. And unlike other countries, we are not proposing banning those strikes, but we do need to know that unions will be held to account. And members of opposition who object to minimum safety levels, well, they'll need to explain, Mr. Speaker, to their constituents why it is that if you had a heart attack, a stroke or life-threatening illness on a strike day, there are no minimum safety standards in place. And Mr. Speaker, I see they don't want to hear it, but they'll also need to explain why their leader, without hearing any of these details, has already promised to stand in the way of this legislation and to repeal minimum safety levels which are in the interests of their own constituents, safety levels that are in place in every other mature European democracy in our neighbours' countries that protect lives and would protect livelihoods in this country. And, Mr. Speaker, that's the difference between Conservative government who take these difficult decisions and protect the welfare of our nation and the opposition who too often appear to be in the pay of their union paymasters. I commend this statement to the House.
I now call Shadow Secretary Angela Rayner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I refer the House to my register of interest and that I'm a proud member of a trade union. But what I want to start with by tackling the Secretary of State's comments is the first thing that comes to my mind in this debate, and what the Secretary of State said is my constituent Spina, who waited over an hour for an ambulance, who died waiting for an ambulance, and that was not on a strike day. That is because of the disastrous chaos we have in the system under this Conservative government. In the past few months, Mr. Speaker, we've seen ambulance workers go on their first major strike in 30 years, the first strike ever in the history of the Royal College of Nurses, teachers, pharmacists and civil servants, among others, balloting as we speak. His government offers no solution because they have caused the problem. The economic crisis made in Downing Street with sky-high inflation and recession has left working people facing an economic emergency. And I recognise that the Secretary of State couldn't even mention the fact that they crashed the economy, let alone apologise for it in his opening statement. Nobody wants to see these strikes happen, Mr. Speaker, least of all the workers who lose a day's pay. But, Mr. Speaker, how is the government responding to the crisis of their own making? Not with any attempt to reach a serious long-term solution in the public interest, but by playing politics and promising yet another sticking plaster. He claims he made progress yesterday, but the readout from the trade union representatives was dismal. Is there any chance of a deal this year? Where is the consultation or meaningful way forward he mentions? Or was this all for show? Because that is the implication of his other proposal, his sacking nurses bill. An outright attack on the fundamental freedom of British working people. How can he say, with a straight face, that this government will always defend the ability to strike? Can he tell us if he stands by his article in the Telegraph last summer, listing yet more plans to attack that basic right? Does he deny they considered banning some key workers from joining a union at all? And so much for levelling up workers' rights, Mr. Speaker. And where is their promised code of conduct on the fire and rehire, long-abandoned employment bill that they promised to tackle insecure work? How he goes on with one breath thanking nurses to sacking nurses, Mr. Speaker. Not just insulting, but utterly stupid. There's no common sense about this at all. He says he recognises pressures faced by key workers, but he knows the NHS cannot find the nurses that they need to work on the ward. He knows the trains don't run even on non-strike days, such as their shortage of staff. So how can he seriously think that sacking thousands of key workers won't just plunge our public services further into crisis? The Transport Secretary admits it won't work. The Education Secretary doesn't want it. And his own government impact assessment finds that it will lead to more strikes and staff shortages. He says he's looking into 6 key areas. What do other ministers think about that? Will they have to disagree too? And if he is scraping the barrel with comparisons of France and Spain, those countries with those laws, he claims, so strikes, lose vastly more strike days than Britain. Has he taken any time at all to speak to their governments or trade unions to learn any real lessons from them? And he quotes the ILO. I'm surprised he even knows what the International Labour Organisation even is. He will know that the ILO requires compensatory measures and an independent arbitrator. Are those in his bill? The ILO also says minimum service levels can only happen in services when the safety of individuals or their health is at stake. This doesn't include transport, the border force and teachers as he proposes. Excess deaths, Mr Speaker, are at their highest levels since the pandemic peak. The public is being put at risk every day due to the government's NHS crisis and staffing shortages. He is right that it's his government's duty to protect the public's access to essential services, but livelihoods and lives are already being lost. We all want minimum standards of safety, service and staffing. It is the ministers failing to provide it. Does he not accept that trade unions and workers already take steps to protect the public during action? He singles out ambulance workers. Paramedics agreed to operate life and limb deals on a trust-by-trust basis, as he knows, to ensure the right care continued to be delivered. He should know that service levels were at 82%, with ambulance workers consistently leaving the picket lines to make sure that emergency calls were responded to. He is threatening, Mr Speaker, to rip up that protection. And for what for? Let's look into what this is really all about. A government that is out of ideas, out of time and fast running out of sticking plasters. A government that is playing politics with nurses and teachers' lives because they can't stomach the cooperation and negotiation that's needed. A government desperately doing all it can to distract from its economic emergency. Mr Speaker, we need negotiation, not legislation. So when is the Minister going to do his job?
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Look, I mean, it's almost as if COVID and the pressures on the NHS never occurred, according to them. It's almost as if, and I'm pretty sure I heard this straight, it's almost as if Putin didn't invade Ukraine, force up energy prices, force up inflation, and it's almost as if the Honourable Lady opposite doesn't think that the rest of Europe is going through exactly the same thing. But I was just reading in the Guardian an article saying exactly this, that other health services are experiencing exactly the same problems. So if we're going to have a sensible debate about it, if we're going to start by working from the facts and then have a discussion, then we ought to acknowledge that COVID and the war in Ukraine are a huge impact on health services here and around the world. And then we can go on to have a sensible conversation about balancing the right to strike, which, as I said right at the top of my speech, is a right that we fully respect and that we fully endorse and we believe is part of the International Labour Organisation's correct diagnosis of a working economy, that people should be able to withdraw their labour. But, Mr Speaker, that should not mean withdrawing their labour at the expense of our constituents' lives. And whilst the Honourable Lady talks about how the ambulance service, in her words, have been reasonable and offered on a trust-by-trust basis backup if there are people who have heart attacks, if there are people who have strokes. Heart attacks and strokes don't accept and don't work to the boundaries of trust borders, they work nationally. And so to manage the ambulance system, we need to know that each and every one of our constituents is protected. And so to deny and to vote against legislation that brings in minimum safety levels to help our constituents is to attack their security and their welfare.
Brendan Clark-Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As well as being completely unable to control their own MPs in terms of joining picket lines or actually give a straight answer as to whether they support any of these strikes or not, I think we can clearly see which members in this House are on the side of the public. So, does my right honourable friend agree with me that what we actually have today are fair and proportionate measures which are actually equivalent to what is already in place in a number of other European countries, such as France and Spain?
Yes, if you do.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend's absolutely right. It's worth the House reflecting that police were banned from striking in 1919, and that agreement's been in place for more than 100 years. It would have been very possible for a minister to come to this dispatch box and say they would do the same with perhaps ambulance workers, maybe with firefighters. That isn't what we're proposing today. We're proposing to bring ourselves in line with other modern European economies. It makes every bit of sense to make sure that if strikes are going to occur, that our constituents' lives are protected with minimum safety levels. Frankly, it's extraordinary that anyone would argue against.
Sorry, thank you, Mr. Speaker. 1 minute. Secretary of State, you clap.
Sorry, I do apologise. SNP spokesperson Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's this government that's already created the most restrictive anti-trade union laws in Europe. So this new right-wing culture war stinks, and they're using ambulance covers as a pretext to attack workers' rights. It was the Tory membership that gave us a Prime Minister who tanked the economy overnight, putting people's mortgages up and giving us higher inflation, and yet it's the Tories who continue to demand that public sector workers take the hit to balance the books. Now, everyone can see the irony, the Tories clapping key workers and now giving them a pay cut and threatening them with a sack in the future for future action. Does he really think ordinary people support Tory plans over the nurses? Does he realise the public can see Pat Cullen and Mick Lynch destroying their arguments in sound bites? Does he actually understand that train commuters who already suffer from appalling service are going to be raging when they find out how much money the train companies are making from strike days, paid for by the taxpayers? So how much money has been paid to the train companies that could have went to workers instead? Now, Mr. Speaker, it's not been easy for the Scottish Government, but they've negotiated better pay settlements for Police Scotland, for train crews and for NHS workers. And one for NHS, it would seem that RCN would be willing to discuss with the UK Government. Actions commended by the unions, but not even acknowledged by Labour. But I would say there are no ambulance strikes in Scotland. And, Mr. Speaker, this is done within a fixed budget, negotiations with one hand tied behind our back. And now, despite working with the unions, Scotland still have the same anti-worker or anti-union legislation imposed on it against the wishes of the Scottish Government, an imposition made easier by the Labour Party agreeing with the Tories that workers' rights should remain at Westminster and not be devolved to Scotland. Mr. Speaker, finally, we do not want to be part of plans designed to sabotage workers' rights. Once again, it is shown quite clearly if Scotland's become a fairer, more equal country that respects workers' rights, the only way to do it is to become a normal, independent country.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman tries to push the argument that somehow this will take us out of step with other European countries. I've already explained we're the ones who are out of step with what already occurs elsewhere in Europe. And if you go beyond Europe, the honourable gentleman will be interested to hear that in countries like Australia, in countries like Canada, in many states in America, blue light, as we would call it here, strikes are banned entirely. So actually we're taking a very moderate approach, a very sensible approach. I would have thought the honourable gentleman would wholeheartedly support protecting his own constituents in that way. And whilst we're taking sort of lectures from him about how the Scottish Government handles these things, Mr. Speaker, I couldn't help notice that Scottish primary school teachers are on strike and secondary teachers go on strike in Scotland on Wednesday.
Salient Saxby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In rural Britain, strikes have a disproportionate impact where there are not other modes of public transport. The nearest alternative hospital may be 60+ miles away, and ambulances have already travelled far further to get there, not to mention vacancy rates in public services are so high due to our housing crisis. Can my right honourable friend confirm how these measures will help support rural communities?
Well, my friend's absolutely right. These so-called forever strikes, which have continued for month after month on the railways, are particularly hurting the rural communities. It's very easy, I think, sometimes for people to imagine that people will just sit at their home, they'll be on Zoom, they'll be on Teams, they'll have those conversations. It's a view of the world which is much easier if you are at a desk job, perhaps in management, much harder if you're in a rural community, if you are the hospital porter who needs to get to the hospital, if you're a cleaner. The very people who are being hurt most by these strikes, which never seem to come to a conclusion on the railways, are the hardest up in society, and this government will stand behind them with minimum service levels.
Mr. Speaker. Oh, Ian. 1 minute, Minister. You're clapping the key workers and next you're sacking the key workers. What's really behind this legislation, only time will tell. But why are you looking towards criminalising the great key workers who brought us through this pandemic, whose only crime is to demand decent wages, terms and conditions for themselves and also a safe environment for themselves and the general public?
Well, look, Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the honourable gentleman is a very enthusiastic supporter of everything that the unions do, and they are an enthusiastic supporter of the honourable gentleman. But I don't understand why, perhaps not all of them, but I don't understand why anyone would seriously have an objection to making sure that if one of his constituents has a heart attack on Wednesday, or has a stroke, or a serious accident, why anyone would object to having a national level of agreed safe services. And that is what we propose, and I'm surprised that he will be voting against the safety of his own constituents.
Sir Julian Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will my right honourable friend try and impress on the members opposite, who keep referring to this as an anti-union measure, that public support will be endangered for the unions if they do not preserve minimum services for people whose lives are at risk?
Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend makes an excellent point, which is what we're trying to do here is to correct a problem that is very current. And actually, Mr. Speaker, honourable and right honourable members opposite can actually help with this, because this Wednesday there is due to be a strike tomorrow where the ambulance workers, the unions, have not provided a national level of guaranteed safety. If they could help to correct that. In fact, if we can get this in place across the economy, and particularly in those vital services, then even though we'll take this primary power, we'll never need to use it. And that would be the ideal solution. So why don't they help us? Why don't they help bring safety to their own constituents? And that will help them, and it will help the unions.
Andy MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister has said that he supports the right to strike, and he's told us he does that by banning workers from striking. Doesn't he see the ridiculous position he's got himself into? And the whole point of having assessments of policy is to find out whether it's going to work or not. And when the government's told their policy is bonkers, the sensible thing is to bin it. And where does he think declaring war on working people is going to end?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I've mentioned a couple of times in the dispatch box, the honourable gentleman would need to explain his position to his friends and colleagues in countries as radical as France and Spain, where they have these rules in place already, and they already act to solve people. This point about the impact assessment, which has been made several times, and I think actually also from the front bench. I should point out that the final impact assessment, because the final way in which this will operate, which is primary legislation and then secondary legislation, statutory instruments to bring it into place, is actually yet to be published. So he's wrong about the impact assessment as well. But how anyone can seriously argue that the impact of having guaranteed rescue by ambulances, for example, if somebody is seriously ill, could harm people is simply beyond belief.
Richard Drax.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Coming back through Heathrow recently, I was speaking to someone who works there, and they were praising the armed forces during the coverage of the border force and saying what an incredible job they did and how the whole process worked without any problems at all, and what a sad reflection it was on the public service in this particular area that they couldn't do the same thing. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that the other side and the unions and many who work in the public service have seemed to have forgotten that we spent £400 billion safeguarding their jobs, their futures and their careers?
So stay.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I do want to pay tribute to the Army, who did fantastic work. The Army, of course, do have no strike clause already, along with the police. It will, once this primary powers have been taken, be up for Secretary of States, including the Home Secretary, to determine and consult in other areas for secondary powers to bring in minimum service levels. Actually, I think most people in the public service, working in the public service, are doing a hugely valuable job. They're trying to do the best. I think many of them are frustrated by their radical union leaders, leading them often up a garden path.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And the right honourable member asked earlier if we would acknowledge the impact of COVID and Ukraine. Of course we would. We live with it every day. All of our constituents live with it every day. All of those working in the NHS and the ambulance service live with it every day. So when he says the British people need to know that when they have a heart attack, a stroke or a serious injury, that an ambulance will turn up, and that if they need hospital care, they have access to it, would he not agree with me that a better way of ensuring that is to deal with the actual problem, to invest, to recruit and retain staff in the NHS and the ambulance service, and provide the service that's being cried out for, not just by us, but by those people themselves, rather than tinker about with what you'll do when you can't solve it? Fix the problem. Might be a better way.
Well, I think the Honourable Lady is right in this sense, that because of COVID, we have seen these huge backlogs, and indeed we're hiring a lot more nurses, for example, as a result. Thousands more since 2019. We're also funding the healthcare system more than ever in history, some £168 billion to do that. And as the Prime Minister described in his speech last week, bringing down those waiting lists is his #1 priority. So we are doing all of those things as well. But it is undeniable that not having a minimum safety level in place during strike days puts lives at risk, and this government will take the responsible decision to prevent that from happening in the future.
Lee Anderson.
Mr. Speaker, now then, I think it's important to remember that public sector workers are employed by and paid for by the great British taxpayer. And whilst I sympathise with some of their demands, does my right honourable friend agree with me that their first loyalty should be to the British taxpayer and not some power-crazed union barons who fund the Labour Party and have in the past paid off Labour MPs' mortgages?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I want to pay tribute to particularly those in the NHS. There's a very good reason why over 1 million people in the NHS received a pay rise last year, when the country was having a zero pay rise because of COVID in the public sector, and they did get a pay rise. The pay rise proposed at the moment is worth about £1,400 per individual. I appreciate that in these times, and with Putin's evil war and the impact that's had on inflation, everyone would like more money as a pay rise, but a government's got to consider what that would do to people's taxes, what it would do to interest rates, what it would do to mortgage rates, and how we'd get into a circle, where we're never able to get inflation down. Inflation's the biggest evil of all. We're taking sensible steps to address it. That lot over there simply want to roll over and not address the difficult problems.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I refer to my register of interest. The Royal College of Emergency Medicine has highlighted how there is over 300 excess deaths every single week. So I'd like to know where the government's minimum service level agreement is to the public right now. But the best way to avert a strike is to negotiate. So within his legislation, what obligations will there be on government to enter meaningful negotiations, and how does he describe meaningful?
I just want to pick the Honourable Lady up on those figures, because the NHS themselves will say they don't recognise those numbers. And I do know for sure that when we have a strike, such as the one on Wednesday, where ambulance workers are going to go on strike, there's no way in which she or anybody else in this House can realistically argue that people will somehow be better off without a national minimum safe level of service. That is what we're going to focus on, and that is why she and the benches opposite should support this bill.
Laura Farris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend was right to mention other European countries, but he could have added to that list South Africa, Argentina, Australia, Canada, all of which are members of the International Labour Organization, all of which have minimum service levels in essential services. And in every single case, the ILO has reviewed the MSL and determined it to be a necessary and proportionate restriction of the Article 11 right to strike. Does my right honourable friend agree that the British people are entitled to exactly the same lawful protection to have their basic needs met at times of industrial action in essential services?
Well, my honourable friend, Mr. Speaker, it's worth reminding the House, is an acknowledged expert in employment law, and I'm grateful for her thoughts and clarification that the International Labour Organization do say this is compatible with Article 11. I have been able to sign off the ECHR compatibility on this measure, because, as she rightly points out, it's not just our friends and neighbours in Europe, but around the world, where strikes are, in many cases, banned, not what we're proposing, but certainly minimum safety levels are in place. So there is nothing illegitimate about what we're doing. It fits with the ILO, and who signs up to the ILO? To TUC and many other unions besides.
Chris Stevens.
Mr. Speaker, every single concern that the Secretary of State and all those in the government benches have raised so far is already covered by existing legislation, because trade unions are legally obliged to provide life and limb cover. That's the existing law. So can the Secretary of State tell us what is the difference between his proposed legislation and the new legislation, because that will then be the test on whether this is an attack on workers or not.
Well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the honourable gentleman raises a good point, which I'm very pleased to answer. Where we have the strikes tomorrow and we can't get a simple answer to the question of what the national level of emergency cover will be for people in the most urgent of situations, heart attacks, strokes, other life-threatening ailments, that is the reason why we need minimum safety levels. When for many, many months, some of the poorest in society have been unable to go to work to earn their own living, perhaps as a cleaner, as a hospital porter. That is why we need minimum service levels on our railways. And I very much hope the honourable gentleman will see the point, help to represent his constituents who are being prevented from earning money or indeed from being safe should they have an accident tomorrow.
Nicky Aiken.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Last week I met Daniel Jobs, who runs the Wardrobe Kitchen Bar and Restaurant in the city. He didn't open last week because he said it was no point because of the rail strike. Before Christmas, he lost tens of thousands of pounds because of the rail strike, because people were just cancelling because they couldn't come in to central London. UK Hospitality calculates that around £1 billion of business was lost in central London because of the rail strikes. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that, yes, it is right to protect the right to strike, but there must be legislation in place to protect other sectors like hospitality, protect businesses and protect from job losses?
Minister.
Well, our honourable friend makes an excellent point, and actually it brings me on to an important consideration, which is the disparity at the moment between the public sector settlements on offer and actually the average in the private sector at the moment, which has typically been lower. And so it is right that as a responsible government you have to balance off all of these different considerations across the economy. And for those running small businesses, tea rooms, pubs, the services sector, it is right that we consider them in this balance, which is why minimum service levels as well as minimum safety levels are absolutely right for this economy.
Richard Bergen.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I've listened carefully to what the Secretary of State has had to say, and however he tries to dress it up, this is part of an alarming authoritarian drift. We've got an attack on the democratic right to strike, an attack on the democratic right to vote through attempted vote rigging through the introduction of voter ID, and an attack on the democratic right to peaceful protest. Isn't the Secretary of State ashamed to be a member of the most authoritarian government in Britain in living memory?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I've heard some stuff at the dispatch box, but the idea that this is the most authoritarian government, has he seen what happens in truly authoritarian states? It's actually absolutely ludicrous claim. Particularly in Marxist states, yeah, it's a ludicrous claim about British democracy. And actually, he can help with his many union links, because all we're saying is we'll take powers to ensure that the minimum safety level exists. We're also saying at the same time we don't need to use these powers. We simply need to get agreement for his constituents and for our constituents that on a strike day an ambulance would be able to turn up because national levels have been agreed. That is it, and he should get on board and support this.
Angela Richardson.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Last week, rail users in Guildford trying to get in and out of the constituency, including key workers, were completely cut off. There were 0 trains. At no point has the opposition condemned widespread strike action that disrupts the public. Will my right honourable friend agree with me and join with me in asking the opposition to back these measures that we are putting forward to keep the public safe, but to keep our economy going and growing?
Well, friends, absolutely right. If you look at whose side we're on people who are working hard, who are trying to get on with their lives and livelihoods, who are concerned about their lives when it comes to emergency services. If you look across the benches here, who are they interested in? They haven't once condemned these strikes. Not once have I heard them condemn these strikes. They've been inflicting people's lives now, month after month after month. Not a word from this side opposite. And when we try to bring in even the most moderate and considerate legislation, which simply says that we will ask for a minimum safety level, what do? They object to it and again attack their own constituents in the process.
Order. May I just gently remind members that Mr. Speaker has determined that anybody who came in 5 minutes after the start of the session will not be called. Colin Eastwood.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I know that the Secretary of State likes to fly around in his own private plane, but I can tell him for a fact, whilst he's been doing that, nurses in my constituency, many of them, have been accessing food banks. This government seems very uncomfortable with nurses standing on picket lines, but totally relaxed about them lining up to get food for their families at food banks. If this government is serious about stopping the strikes, surely now is the time, Secretary of State, to pay these essential workers properly.
Minister.
Well, I'd be interested to hear whether the front bench's policy is to pay a 19% pay rise. And if they're going to do that, if they're able to explain how they'll raise the extra money, will that be extra taxation, Mr. Deputy Speaker? Will they be putting it on borrowing with all the hikes in interest rates, mortgage rates and car loans and the rest of it that would bring? That is the question that they need to answer. And the more they waffle around the subject, rather than actually bring forward serious measures to limit the impact of these strikes at the most serious point, the life and death point, the less they will get the respect of the general public.
Greg Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. My right honourable friend is absolutely right to bring forward these proportionate measures, not least the urgency with which he seeks to protect the safety and lives of all of our constituents at risk from strike action. But when it comes to minimum service standards on the railways, will he agree with me that children have suffered in these strikes? Many children in Buckinghamshire use the railways to get to school, and that in the consultation that comes forward, the ability of children to get to school on the railways must be included in that minimum service level.
Well, my honourable friend makes an excellent point, because we've talked about workers getting to work, we've talked about people losing their salaries because of these strikes, but actually also children are being impacted with their education. And I think that is absolutely crying shame, particularly after 2 years of COVID, all of that having to study from home, to be put through this again when there is a decent offer on the table for railway, which, by the way, when union bosses have actually put to their members, with the TSSA, for example, they accepted the offer, a very similar offer to the ones that the RMT and other unions refuse to put to their members. So again, we just need some common sense from these unions, and I hope a little pushing from members opposite.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Can the Secretary of State not just for once acknowledge the stress levels of workers, postal workers, rail workers, health workers, teachers, who've had 10 years of frozen pay, 10 years of reducing living standards, going through enormous stress at work, many leaving the teaching and nursing professions as a result of it. Nobody likely votes to take strike action unless it's an act of desperation. They do it because they want to get decent pay for themselves and their loved ones and their families. Can he not, for once, face the issue of the poverty that people face, rather than trying to bring in draconian laws to prevent people taking effective action in order to remedy the injustice that they are currently facing?
Minister. It's obviously not true, Mr Deputy Speaker, that there's been pay freeze for 10 years. And it stands there and makes a claim. I just actually mentioned from the dispatch box that because the NHS was under huge pressure during COVID. Actually, nurses and workers in the NHS, 1.2 million, I think, in total, were provided an uplift last year of £1,400, I think, or £1,200 last year, £1,400 proposed this year, even though, at the time, inflation was low, even though the rest of the public sector wasn't receiving pay increases. But he talks about stress for public sector workers, and I do recognise the hard work that they put in and the hours that they put in, particularly in the NHS, which is why we've expanded by many thousand the number of nurses, for example. But what about the stress for people who can't get to work with these strikes and haven't been able to for months? What about the stress for people who might be waiting for an ambulance when we don't have nationally agreed safety levels in place? That's the stress that I'm also worried about.
Chris Loder.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Would my right honourable friend agree with me that when unions such as the RMT reduce their customary referendum period from 14 to 6 days to force through a false ballot result to strike, and then go to strike straight away against necessarily the wishes of all members, would he agree with me that this is an important piece, an important statement to make, an important piece of legislation, and will he confirm how promptly he will bring forward this bill to the House?
Minister. Well, the House of the bill itself is being introduced today. My honourable friend's absolutely right about this. One of the things that we saw with the RMT is that they haven't put the offers to their members, and I think that's a real problem. As I mentioned before, the TSSA had put an almost identical offer. It was accepted by the members, and the strike was therefore over. So I think any attempt to not allow members to see the full range, the full view of what is being offered is wrong. And because members haven't seen the full offer, they'll be unaware of the various different elements of that offer because it hasn't been formally put to their members. That is something that the unions can change immediately, and I very much hope that they do.
Joanne Cherry.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I noticed a moment ago that the Secretary of State said that striking workers were in danger of pushing up interest rates. Can I just remind him that many of these people are on strike because they can't afford their mortgages or their rent as a result of the hike in interest rates caused by his colleagues' economic incompetence. And I imagine that many of these essential workers are in receipt of the sort of wage that the Secretary of State wouldn't get out of bed for in the morning. Having said that, on the issue of the legality, of this legislation, the General Secretary of the TUC has said that to force workers who have democratically voted to strike, to force them to work and to sack them if they don't comply would almost certainly be illegal. Now, isn't that right? And can the Minister really say that in every respect the detail of his bill will comply with the United Kingdom Government's obligations both under ECHR and under international labour law? On the detail, Minister, what's the position?
Mr Deputy Speaker, I don't know if I'm correcting myself or correcting the Honourable Lady, but I wasn't saying that striking, well, I didn't mean to say at least, that striking workers push up interest rates. It's inflation that pushes up interest rates. So if you pay 19%, and if you did that across the economy, you would have to borrow the money. You would then have to have more borrowing, more debt, and therefore higher interest rates. And everybody would pay more in their mortgages, in their car loans. Businesses would pay more. That is the quite simple maths that I would have thought we've actually tested to destruction. And it would not make sense to go ahead along those lines. She asked specifically about the ECHR. I can confirm that this is ECHR compliant. My honourable friend has left her place now, talked about employment law and how this fits with the ILO and with the ECHR. I have been able to sign that. And I can further confirm that there is proof of this, because many other countries, many of our neighbours already do exactly the same thing, also within the ECHR.
Jonathan Gallis.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. May I proudly put on the record my register of interest as a former teacher and a former trade union member and representative for the NASUWT. Mr Deputy Speaker, I am very worried about seeing teachers going on strike, because it's the pupils that will suffer the most, particularly disadvantaged pupils from areas like Stoke-on-Trent North, Kidsgrove and Torquay. And whilst I am a huge admirer of the incredible work teachers do, they are sadly being cajoled by barren bosses in unions like the Not Education Union, led by Bolshevik Balsen and Commie Courtney, with their Labour mates to force teachers out of the classroom and make sure that kids continue to suffer. What can we do to make sure pupils will not be victims any further?
Minister.
Well, minimum levels of service, of education and elsewhere will of course help. But again, I do just want to stress to the House, we are not legislating in order to necessarily want to or wish to introduce legislation in all these areas. That will be a matter for the House on secondary legislation. It will be a matter for further consultations. I very much hope that it does, though, give the unions and some of their supporters in this House the opportunity to stop and think about whether minimum safety is appropriate in their particular areas. And when it comes to teaching, I very much hope that they'll hold back from the threshold of strikes, which will be damaging to them and to the pupils.
Zara Sultana.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Nurses' pay down 20%, teachers' pay down 20%, firefighters' pay down 12%, junior doctors' pay down 26%. That's the consequences of 13 years of Tory rule. So let's be honest, let's talk about the real problem here. It's not workers going on strike, it's a Tory government and the economy that they've built that forces workers to strike. And this new anti-worker law would make things even worse, sacking teachers and nurses for striking for fair pay. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, surely the easiest, safest and fairest way of guaranteeing minimum service provision is to have nurses and firefighters and paramedics paid a decent wage with good conditions and the resources to do their jobs. Why won't he do that instead?
Well, I think perhaps the Honourable Lady might want to inquire from her front bench, most of them are gone now, but one or two still here, whether they would themselves support a 19% pay increase. And if they do, nice as it would be to do, how are they going to explain that to their constituents? How are they going to explain that to the financial markets as interest rates rise? And will they, if they do spread it across the entire economy, what will the impact be on the economy at large? And those are the simple but unfortunately difficult decisions that need to be made in government. And frankly, Mr Deputy Speaker, their failure to answer those basic questions are why they are not ready to run this country.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. It's not often I get asked to halfway through, but I'm very pleased to do so.
You're moving up the order.
Anyway, the sentiments expressed in this chamber about seeking a solution do not appear to be matching the negotiations outside of this chamber. The Secretary of State will know that for many of the NHS staff, this is not just about monies alone, it's also about safety in the wards, with many nurses stating that they would be happy with additional staff to lighten the load, along with a modest payroll to cover the cost of living. Can the Secretary of State indicate what assessment has been made about safety in the wards in light of ongoing action? And will the Secretary of State guarantee safety and a cost of living wage increase?
Minister.
Mr Deputy Speaker, of course one of the reasons why we've been employing thousands, tens of thousands now, of more nurses, doctors, is to help to relieve the pressure post-COVID. And I think we all understand that given what happened in COVID and given what's now happened with flu, which is the worst for 10 years, we're seeing particularly strong pressures on our hospitals. The point that I'm making today is none of this is helped by the uncertainty. fine to withdraw your labour, obviously a last resort, but we understand it. But please, give us an indication, or guarantee at least, of where the safety level will be, and do so on a nationwide basis, in fairness to the nurses and the Royal College of Nurses, just as they've done, but not, I'm afraid, as has been done with the ambulance unions, and we invite them to do the same thing.
Sam Desi.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. The government's failed industrial relations approach has led to the worst strikes in decades, and sadly they've often sought to scupper talks at the last minute by throwing in last-minute spanners. And now they're proposing to go from clapping nurses to actually sacking nurses. The Secretary of State will be aware that the Transport Minimum Service Level Bill's impact assessment stated that imposing minimum service levels could actually increase the frequency of strikes. So what exactly has changed in the last 2 months since that was published?
Minister.
Well, first of all, no one is talking about sacking nurses. In fact, I've just checked the figures. Over 44,000 more nurses since 2010, over 34,000 more doctors, big increase even from 2019. Nothing that we are announcing today in this bill from the dispatch box, Mr Deputy Speaker, is about getting rid of nurses any more than any employment contract has to be followed. It's worth remembering that the pay that is on offer is as a result of the independent pay review body. Bodies that the unions themselves called to be set up 20 years ago being put into action. And on the point about last-minute spanners, I have heard union bosses make this point. It's completely untrue. I seem to somehow be living rent-free in Mitt Lynch's head at the moment. I haven't even been close to these negotiations. The deal that's on the table is the same discussion that's always been there. Rather than parroting those lines, the honourable gentleman might do better to check the facts and actually encourage the unions to put these offers to their members.
David Linden.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Deputy Speaker. When the Tory party spoke about taking back control, none of us thought it would be suppressing votes with voter ID legislation, a policing and crime bill that curbs the right to protest, a House of Lords with unelected clerics, and a government that's withdrawing the basic fundamental human right to strike. How much longer is this government going to continue that this silly little island is now a functioning democracy?
Well, Mr Speaker, I'm pretty sure the honourable gentleman was in here from the beginning, otherwise you wouldn't have called him to speak, Mr Deputy Speaker. And he therefore will have heard me said, not once or twice, but I think 3 times now, that this legislation is compatible with the International Labour Organisation that the unions themselves sign up to and that we see all of our, or many of our European nations follow. So I'm rather struggling to follow his argument that this is somehow unfair or undemocratic or somehow against international law.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Mr Deputy Speaker, you think from the way the Secretary of State is speaking, and he is resorting to being the knight on a white charger coming to rescue the system. But let's be clear, it was this government that froze pay in the public sector and then increases below inflation. It's this government that reduced recruitment in the National Health Service, particularly among nurses, and we have a 40,000 gap just in them alone. What we're actually hearing, aren't we, is chickens coming home to roost, and he ought to take responsibility as a minister in this government.
Minister.
Well, I simply made the point that it's not the case that we've frozen recruitment because we've got 44,000 more nurses, not fewer nurses. So that's an increase rather than a decrease. It's also not the case, other than during the aftermath of the financial crash, which, as I recall, happened under the party opposite, and we had to pick up, and through COVID, but as I mentioned, not all the way through COVID, because last year, even whilst the rest of the public service was experiencing a freeze in pay, we paid more for the unions, for the workers in the NHS. So we made an exception to them. So simply, her narrative's simply not true. And I don't understand, again, that if her and her front bench and her party are saying they would pay 19% more, where is that money coming from? And whose taxes are going to be raised in order to pay for that and the increased interest rates?
Sam Tarry.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I draw the House as my register of interest. Mr Deputy Speaker, what I find astonishing is I didn't realise we were comparing with France and with Spain. We're talking about Franco's Spain and the Vichy regime of France. In this country, we already have so many elements of our laws which do not comply with ILO regulations. We are one of the most restrictive anti-worker countries in the world, and that, Mr Deputy Speaker, is a fact. What I would like to see, what my constituents would like to see, is this government stop blowing up the talks with trade unions, as they did against the NHS over this weekend, with Unite Reps coming out of that meeting in a worse state of having moved things forward, or dropping in driver-only operation into talks to blow it up with the RMT. This government, Mr Deputy Speaker, could end the strikes in multiple sectors. Instead, what they've done is up the ante to wage war on working people suffering because of their rancid government.
Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, at least we know where the honourable gentleman stands, because against the instructions from this front bench, it's on the picket lines. And he's one of the people who's helped to extend these strikes on rail. Things like driver-only operation have been in there right from the outset. There's been absolutely no change in that at all. It makes perfect sense. It actually operates on the line that my constituency happens to be on. It causes no problems at all. It's a very safe way to operate. It's the kind of modernisation that would help to bring this industrial dispute to a close. And his point about, I didn't follow that, about France and Spain. Franco, the Vichy government, I mean, Spain and France have moved on just a little bit from that and seem to manage, under the International Labour Organization, have minimum safe levels of service on strike days.
Lockhart.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State opened his statement with very warm words regarding our key workers, but he will be acutely aware that the longer that the government refuses to address the fair pay demands of key workers, the more staff morale is depleting and the more people will leave the service, exacerbating the staffing crisis highlighted by the unions as part of their demands. Does the Secretary of State not see that standing here lecturing about safe staffing levels when healthcare workers across the UK are saying staffing levels are unsafe is quite frankly ridiculous, and that the way to ensure staffing at all times is to pay our healthcare workers properly?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, of course we want to see healthcare workers paid, and I meant the words that I used right at the top of this. Members of the House will remember my father was ill during COVID. I experienced the NHS at its best and most heroic whilst they were struggling to serve people under almost unbelievable pandemic circumstances. So I absolutely agree with her about the incredible work they do. There is a pay offer on the table that hasn't been invented by the government. It's come from the independent pay review bodies. The government has accepted in full and in every circumstance of the independent pay review body this year, their recommendation. And for those who say that we should ignore the independent pay review bodies, they need to explain why that is, and also where they'll find the money to do that in order for it to be fair to the other taxpayers.
Greenwood.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. This statement is an attack on fundamental employment rights. Over 12 years of Conservative government failure to invest in vital public services has led to nurses, ambulance crews, civil servants and transport workers taking industrial action. I stand in solidarity with them. If the government wanted to protect levels of public service, it will give them the funding and staffing that they need instead of running them down. So why is the government determined to run down our public services, determined to run down our National Health Service, and why won't ministers engage in proper negotiations to end these disputes?
Mr Deputy Speaker, in the politest possible way, I think the problem ones have been going for an hour on these things, and some of the questions which were written in advance and possibly even handed out by some of the unions, which have already been categorically disproved because this is not, as I've explained many times, against international law or indeed the ECHR for all the reasons I've already covered, continue to be read out as if it's a new contribution from scratch, seem to ignore the basic fact that there's an other side to this, which is the safety of her and our constituents, who tomorrow, when there's an ambulance strike, but the unions refuse to commit to national safety levels with the management of the trusts, means that everyone's lives will be more at risk than they should be. It is a perfectly reasonable measure to introduce what happens throughout much of the rest of the world and certainly our European neighbours, and have standards which are minimum safety standards in place so that we can protect the public.
Mary Kelly-Foy.
Mr Speaker. This government intends using minimum service levels to force workers to work against their wishes, undermine their legitimate disputes and impose servitude on workers. The fact is that the safest level of provision is to have our firefighters, nurses, teachers, paramedics and rail staff being paid a proper, decent wage and given the appropriate resources so that they can do their jobs effectively. So can the Minister explain why he now needs a new law to help this government effectively drive down the wages of those key workers and vital services that he clapped during the pandemic?
Mr Deputy Speaker, I think I picked up the Honourable Lady describing people working in servitude if they have the minimum service levels. Servitude. Can I point out to the Honourable Lady they would be paid for that servitude? Can I point out to the Honourable Lady that in Network Rail the average worker is on £46,000 of servitude, that if they're a train driver the average is £62,000 of servitude? I really think that if we're going to have a serious debate about minimum service levels designed to ensure that the school kid can get to school again, that the office worker who may be on the lower pay are able to get to their job, that constituents of members throughout this House are able to guarantee minimum safety levels during a strike tomorrow, the idea that that isn't somehow enforcing servitude is absolute nonsense.
Paula Barker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I refer to my register of interest. The government benches talk about hard-working members of the public. Will the Secretary of State acknowledge that trade union members are also hard-working members of the public?
Absolutely.
Will the Secretary of State also confirm if the reported figure of £320 million to the train operators has indeed been paid during these strikes because they are indemnified? How much would it have taken to settle the strikes out of that £320 million? And we've heard a lot about safety measures today. So when will the government stop trying to force through driver-only operated trains, and when will they get the workforce strategy that our NHS so desperately needs?
Minister.
The Rail Minister reminds me that driver-only operated trains were introduced under the Labour government. They are entirely safe. The operators I mentioned on my Govia line, and I've never had a single constituent come to me and say otherwise. She asks about whether trade union members are hard-working. I absolutely agree with her. They are. Many work extraordinary hours, and I already talked about that, particularly in the context of health, but elsewhere across the economy. It's just that a responsible government has to balance the pay in the public sector with the pay in the private sector and across all elements of the economy. And that's why we have the independent pay review bodies. And unless the party opposite is now trying to destroy independent pay review bodies and say we should ignore them and go beyond what they say, I don't see a better alternative. She has a fundamental misunderstanding, though, Mr Deputy Speaker, about the way that the railways operate in this country. The receipts are collected, and the train operating companies simply receive the money for operating the service.
Gavin Newlands.
Last week, the member for Glasgow East and I proudly supported picketing workers at Glasgow Central. And not only did we not have to ask for permission, nobody was photoshopped out of the photograph either. Avanti West Coast and TransPennine can barely deliver a minimum service as it is. The Smith Commission could have devolved employment rights to ensure the right to strike was sacrosanct and fire and rehire banned, but Labour blocked it. Mick Lynch said Scottish ministers want to resolve issues, whereas politicians down here want to exacerbate them. Therefore, isn't it the case that Scottish workers will only be fully protected with independence?
Well, I never expected that contribution from the benches over there. I should just point out to him I would never knowingly remove the former Prime Minister, who I served enthusiastically from anything that I put out if I knew that it was going out that way. But he makes the point about Scottish independence, somehow shoehorned into a debate about minimum safety levels. His constituents will be amongst the first to benefit when there are national strikes and we are able to run a minimum safe level of service, for example, between ambulances and the hospitals.
Mick Whitley.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker.
The measures outlined today represent a profound attack on the rights of those key workers with whom the government is still in active negotiation. The government's strategy is clear. When can it not get what it wants through negotiation and compromise, it will simply legislate to get its own way. But does the Secretary of State accept that these proposals risk breaching human rights legislation and potentially even modern-day slavery law? And will he concede that the public interest would be better served by addressing the legitimate grievances of the nurses, firefighters, teachers and rail workers who are now in dispute, rather than by curbing their democratic right to take industrial action?
Minister.
Mr Deputy Speaker, how many times do I need to, I'm going to check the Hansard record afterwards, explain that the ILO says itself that it is perfectly proper to have minimum safety levels in place, that many of our European neighbours already have that in place, that many other countries, Australia, Canada, parts of America, South Africa and elsewhere, actually ban strikes in blue light services. We ban them ourselves for the police, but I'm not even proposing going that far. All I'm saying is, please, tell us if you're going to withdraw your labour. Let's agree a minimum safety level. I don't think there's anything unreasonable about that whatsoever, and I have to say I'm shocked the party opposite does.
Andrew Gwynn.
Thank you. I refer to my entry in the register as a proud member of GMB and Unite the Union. But the reality, Mr Deputy Speaker, is that the government has refused for months to discuss pay with nurses. They failed to avert the transport strikes, and they are now introducing these shoddy plans to distract from their own failure to negotiate. Now, I know the Secretary of State earlier said he doesn't meaningfully erase the former Prime Minister from his tweets, but that's exactly what he did recently. So perhaps he should spend less time on Photoshop and more time on the day job, sitting down and negotiating.
Minister.
This is a slightly stretched a question, but I think the basis of it was quite straightforward, which is, as I've mentioned, it makes perfect sense to have a situation where you can guarantee for your constituents, and I'm interested in what the honourable gentleman would say to his constituents tomorrow, when they may or may not be able to call an ambulance, depending on the trust that he's in, about the failure to support national minimum safety standards. Well, I don't think his constituents should suffer from a postcode lottery, and I'm prepared to legislate to make sure that doesn't happen, even if he doesn't want it.
Peter Grant.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. In 5 years, when I had the privilege of leading the third largest council in Scotland with a workforce of 20,000, we had our share of industrial disputes. Every single time the unions came to us well in advance, and they told us what parts of services they wanted to exempt from industrial action, because they cared as much for the welfare of vulnerable people as we did. Isn't it the case that if the government cared half as much about education as teachers do, if they cared half as much about the health service as nurses and ambulance drivers do, if they cared half as much for a decent public transport service as train drivers do, this bully boy legislation would not be needed? The enemies of the health service are not on the picket line, they're on the government front bench.
Minister.
Well, when you listen to the benches over there, it makes it sound like they don't have any industrial strife. I mean, I think it's fantastic if the unions and the management get together to resolve these things. That's exactly what we want to see happen. But the reality is, where it doesn't happen, strikes evolve sometimes. And this legislation is about making sure those strikes are less damaging, particularly when it comes to people's health and the security of the nation. But he makes his point as if they don't have strikes in primary schools. He makes his point as if secondary schools in Scotland aren't going on strike where it's devolved on Wednesday. And the reality is sometimes strikes do break out. When they do, we want to make sure the public is properly protected.
Mike Ainsbury.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Just before Christmas, I went along to the ambulance station in Warrington, that's North West Ambulance Trust, and I spoke to workers there which have withdrawn their labour, paramedics, ambulance workers. They'd done that with a heavy heart. They'd done that as a last resort. They'd done that because they were fighting for a fair deal, because the mortgages have gone up and the food bills have gone up. They were providing, while I was there, by the way, a minimum level of service. I saw the ambulances going out. and rightfully so, to deal with critical care incidents. So the current arrangements actually facilitate that. Yeah. This is very un-British. It's a fundamental attack on the democratic right to withdraw one's labour. And how many teachers are going to be sacked? How many ambulance workers are going to be sacked? How many social workers are going to be sacked? How many rail workers will be sacked for standing up to their right to strike and withdraw their labour?
Minister.
Well, the answer to the question is none. I mean, I haven't seen a single police officer sacked or a member of the army sacked. They have no strike deals. We're not proposing no strike deals here. We're simply saying, I think very reasonably, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that those fantastic workers, and I accept what he says about people going on strike with a heavy heart, those fantastic workers who were, in his particular case, in his particular ambulance trust, receiving a level of emergency service, well, that service should be provided to all members across the House. No matter where you are, that should not be down to a failure for the union to agree that with the management, as is the case tomorrow. And I rather hope that he and the members opposite on the front bench will join with us in persuading them to provide that minimum safety level. And if not, they will need to explain to their constituents why they're failing to vote to support the safety and security of their own constituents' lives.
Cat Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and draw the House's attention to my register of members' interests as a proud member of Unite and the GMB trade unions. During the pandemic, my constituents and I stood on our doorsteps and we clapped our key workers. We clapped those nurses at the Royal Lancaster Infirmary in Blackpool Vic, and we clapped postal workers working out of our delivery offices in Lancaster, Fleetwood and Garstown. And now this government is putting more effort into putting those workers' jobs at risk than trying to resolve the strike. Now, it's very clear that the Minister is very upset about the ongoing strikes, and I can assure him that many of the workers who are losing days and days of pay are upset too. So, can I try and help the Minister and suggest that he puts more effort into sitting down with trade unions and finding a resolution than trying to stamp on workers' rights?
Minister.
Well, as the Honourable Lady will know, the various different unions have been invited in. There's been discussions across the different sectors, and we are doing everything that we can to encourage a settlement. I do need to sort of gently point out to members opposite that this isn't a government that has ignored the independent pay review bodies and somehow come up with its own number and say, halve the amount of money that was suggested should be paid. We've actually accepted in full the recommendation of these independent pay review bodies. And so we're actually following the science and following the evidence. And she's wrong to suggest and to continue frightening people by saying that their jobs could be at risk. Nobody's job is at risk. I've already explained we're hiring more, particularly not nurses and doctors. This legislation simply will say that if we can't get there from a voluntary point of view across the country, not just, for example, in the Honourable Gentleman's constituency, but everywhere, then we will have legislative power to make sure that we're able to require minimum safety levels for everybody, not just some.
Alison Thoots.
Thank you. Teaching staff at my daughter's school are on strike today, and at my son's school are on strike tomorrow, and I fully support their right to do so. We all know that the Scottish Government's budget is constrained, having been shortchanged and underfunded in the face of soaring inflation. So what discussions has he had with the Chancellor to ensure a fair funding settlement for the Scottish Government so that Scottish public sector workers can get the pay rise they deserve to deal with the Tory cost of living crisis?
Minister.
Well, look, all of us want our kids to be able to get to school, and the example in Scotland demonstrates that strikes occur regardless of who is in power potentially at the particular moment. But she is wrong, and I think the opposition front bench is wrong as well, to suggest that this is something which is somehow a UK problem, doesn't affect other parts of the world, because exactly the opposite is the case. We are in this situation, we have this level of inflation because of the war in Ukraine, because Putin illegally invaded his neighbour's country, because it pushed up energy prices, and because that pushed up inflation. It makes all of us poorer when that happens. But if members think, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that the solution is to simply not worry whilst people's livelihoods and safety is put at risk, that will be up to them when they go to vote. This party will be voting to ensure people's security and their safety during no matter which strikes come next.
Kate Osborne.
Thank
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. The Minister's proposals criminalise workers for taking action in legitimate disputes, threatening to turn the clock back on workers' rights by 200 years. The Tolpuddle martyrs were criminalised for withdrawing their labour and deported to Australia, as were the 7 men of Jarrow for protesting about their working conditions. These proposals would see the NHS, education and other key workers sacked for the same crime. Mr Deputy Speaker, workers need a pay rise, not a P45. And when will ministers put our country first and invest in, not attack, key workers?
Mr Deputy Speaker, the Honourable Lady is wrong, and actually on several fronts. And first of all, it can't be criminal if, in fact, that's a law that this House has passed. Secondly, it's no more criminal than breaching an employment contract. I mean, that's the level of, as she describes, criminality. I mean, if this is going to be the line, if this is how they're going to explain to their constituents on the doorsteps over the next few days or weeks, when ambulances aren't necessarily going to turn up in one area and may in another, and their only answer is, we didn't think that we should put the same measures in place that occur already in countries like France and Spain and Italy and elsewhere, then can I just suggest to her that rather than raving on about criminalisation, which is an utter nonsense, when nobody is criminalising anything, simply agreeing minimum safety levels is a proportionate, sensible and modern way to go about things, and I think she should support it.
Finally, Beth Winter.
Mr Deputy Speaker. As the TUC says, public sector workers have experienced the longest pay squeeze in 200 years, with workers losing out on £20,000 worth of wages due to pay not keeping up with prices since 2008. Now, when we experience historically high inflation, the government wants to both reduce real terms pay and legislate to enforce it. Isn't it the case that the government is proposing yet another authoritarian, draconian act to enforce its attack on our living standards?
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure if these questions, which have remained remarkably consistent throughout, have been handed out by the front bench or by perhaps their union paymasters. But the fundamental facts are that the independent pay review bodies decide on the level of pay, and the government has accepted that in full. And if these questions are being handed out by the front bench, then the front bench will need to explain what they plan to do with the independent pay review bodies. Because are they going to routinely now ignore their advice, because that's not something that we have done? Are they going to tell their constituents that you won't have a minimum safe level of service if you have a heart attack or if you have a stroke? Or are they going to pay the 19%, in which case they need to explain to their constituents why their tax is going up, why inflation is going up further, and why interest rates are going up as well?
Order. Point of order.
As someone who spent 33 years on the front line in the NHS, I'm disappointed that I haven't been able to contribute to this debate and highlight that actually the biggest challenge to all 4 NHSs and patient safety is protection of the workforce. Yep. That is because,
Order. This is an endeavour to extend the question time. The Honourable Lady, I may be green as a Deputy Speaker, but I'm long in the tooth in the chair. The Speaker has made it absolutely plain that honourable members on either side of the House must be here at the start of the question session in order to participate. The Honourable Lady is fully aware that she was not here. She'll take her seat, please. Order. 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 That is a matter that the Honourable Lady may wish to raise with Mr. Speaker, but it is not a question for me now. If it's the same question, it'll be the same answer.
I mean, in a serious issue, when the government going up in market forces, except when it comes to workers, we need some notice when things are changing in this place. Because at the moment, the start of things are pretty chaotic, Mr. Deputy Speaker. We should have a bell ringing, give us at least 5-minute warning, so that people will know when things are changing.
The Honourable Gentleman has been in this House for a very long time indeed. Perhaps not quite as long as I have, but he's been here for a very long time. And he knows perfectly well that it is an honourable member's duty and responsibility to be here on time when the session starts. He was not here. Order. I'm now moving on. I have to notify the House that in accordance with the Royal Assent Act 1967, His Majesty has signified his royal assent to the following Act. Finance Act 2023. Presentation of Bill, Mr. Secretary Shapps.
Strikes Minimum Service Levels Bill.
Second reading what day?
Tomorrow.
No! Second reading tomorrow.